Hey guys! Tonight we're stepping into the quiet, uncomfortable world of medieval executioners. The people everyone needed, but nobody wanted to talk to. So, dim your lights, grab your tea, or whatever medieval beverage you think goes well with mild existential dread, and settle in. Because we're about to spend the next while with some of the most socially awkward professionals in history. Executioners. The guys who were technically civil servants, but couldn't even buy bread without someone spitting on it first. Because you see, when they weren't swinging axes or lighting pyres, they had to live somewhere, eat something, and deal with the fact that everyone knew what they did for a living. Let's start with the basics. Executioners were employed, officially, by the crown, the city, or the local lord. Their job was to handle punishments too unpleasant for the average medieval mayor to deal with. Beheadings, hangings, floggings, amputations, and sometimes a bit of creative dismemberment, depending on the crime and the mood of the judge. But here's the thing. Executions didn't happen every day. In many towns, weeks or even months could pass between official killings. So what did these guys do the rest of the time? That's where things get weird. Let's float back to 14th century France, where records tell us that the executioner of Paris, a man named Sanson, because apparently all executioners were named Sanson at some point, had what we might call a side hustle. He collected garbage and animal carcasses, and occasionally human body parts left over from the job. Because medieval sanitation wasn't exactly modern, someone had to clear away the filth. And since everyone already saw him as unclean, well, it was a natural fit. Executioners often doubled as nightmen or hangmen, responsible for cleaning cesspits, emptying latrines, and dealing with dead animals on the road. So yes, when there were no executions, they were basically medieval garbage men, but with a sword. Now why did they take on these extra jobs? Simple. Nobody else would hire them. Executioners lived under a kind of unofficial curse. They were legally essential, but socially radioactive. Most were banned from living inside city walls. If they entered a church, people moved away. If they went to market, they had to stand in a designated executioner's circle, so no one accidentally brushed against them. Because apparently, touching the guy who just chopped off your cousin's hand was bad luck. Even their families were affected. Wives, children, anyone sharing their last name, automatically tainted by association. Many ended up forming little dynasties of executioners, passing the job down through generations because, honestly, who else was going to marry into that? Let's drift over to Nuremberg in the 1500s. There, the local executioner, Franz Schmidt, kept a diary, and not a short one. Over his 45-year career, he wrote down every single punishment he performed. It's basically a mix of medieval crime reporting and a disturbingly calm grocery list. But what's interesting isn't just his work. It's what he did between executions. Schmidt spent much of his time practicing medicine. Yes, the guy cutting off heads on Friday was setting broken bones on Sunday. It turns out that executioners, with their knowledge of anatomy, sharp instruments, and strong stomachs, were often the only people in town who knew how to handle wounds. Barbers and surgeons trained beside them, and townspeople, desperate enough to forget their superstitions, sometimes came to them for treatment. So, if you had a bad abscess or a dislocated shoulder, you might end up in the same chair where last week's thief met a less fortunate end. Comforting thought. This dual role, healer and killer, created one of the strangest paradoxes in history. Executioners were feared as bringers of death, yet depended on as givers of life. People didn't want to talk to them, but they needed them. Like the medieval version of your least favorite dentist, horrifying but necessary. During slow months, executioners also handled punishments short of death. They whipped petty criminals, branded thieves, and performed public humiliations. Basically, they were the entire Justice Department rolled into one exhausted, underpaid man with a collection of sharp objects. And let's be honest, most of them weren't exactly living the high life. The salary varied wildly. In big cities like Paris, executioners were well-paid civil officers, sometimes earning more than soldiers. But in small towns, they were barely scraping by. So, they improvised. Some sold souvenirs from their work, bits of rope from hangings, ashes from burnt witches, or even the blood of executed men, which people believed had healing powers. Because of course they did. There's a documented case in 17th century Germany where an executioner sold vials of holy blood for a few coins each. He was later reprimanded, not for the scam, but for undercutting the church's relic trade. Medieval capitalism at its finest. Let's drift again. this time to early modern England. The London executioner was a man named Jack Ketch, and he was famously terrible at his job. He once botched the beheading of the Duke of Monmouth so badly it took 5 strikes to finish the job. Eyewitnesses said Ketch apologized mid-swing. Not exactly comforting words when you're the one kneeling. Afterwards, during quieter times, Ketch made money publishing pamphlets, confessions, last words, and true accounts of the criminals he'd executed. Think of it as 17th century true crime YouTube, but in print form. Executioners, it seems, were always trying to find ways to stay relevant, and that's something worth pausing on. The strange boredom of the profession. Imagine being trained your whole life for one task, ending lives in public, and then going weeks, even months with nothing to do. No practice swings, no crowds, just the occasional pig carcass to dispose of. Executioners spent their downtime sharpening blades, maintaining ropes, and preparing instruments that might not be used for months. Some even kept personal logs of how many swings it took to decapitate different criminals. Because in a world with no performance reviews, self-evaluation was the only feedback they got. It was a lonely sort of pride. Morbid, meticulous, and strangely human. Sometimes, when executions did happen, the executioner became a local celebrity. For about 15 minutes. People brought him drinks, slapped him on the back, and treated him like a dark hero. But by the next day, he was back to being the town pariah again. No one wanted to sit next to him at the tavern, and no one wanted to shake his hand, unless they had a toothache. So, between executions, he waited, cleaned, healed, collected garbage, sold souvenirs, raised his kids to someday inherit the world's least glamorous title. And maybe, just maybe, wondered if there was another way to make a living. One that didn't involve both blood and boredom. But for most of them, there wasn't. Because who else was going to do the job no one wanted, for people who didn't want to see it done? Let's drift a bit deeper next time, into the family lives of executioners. The hereditary hangman, the dynasties of darkness that kept swinging generation after generation. Because yes, executioners had lineages. And like most medieval lineages, they got weirder with every century. Hey again, if you're still awake, congratulations. You've made it through the first part of medieval job counseling. Now let's float a little deeper into the lives of those who didn't just do the executions, but inherited them. Because in the weird logic of medieval Europe, if your father chopped off heads for a living, then congratulations, so would you. Execution was one of the few professions you couldn't really apply for. There wasn't a job fair, no now hiring public headsman sign hanging at the city gate. The work just stayed in the family, like a cursed heirloom no one could return. Many towns treated the office of the executioner as hereditary property. It passed from father to son, or sometimes to a son-in-law brave or desperate, enough to marry into the family. The logic was simple. Since no one else would touch the job, it might as well stay in familiar, blood-stained hands. Let's take an example. In 17th century France, there was a family known as the Sanson dynasty. 6 generations of executioners who served the kings of France for nearly 200 years. Yes, that Sanson family, the first, Charles Sanson, was forced into the role after his father-in-law died. He didn't want it, few ever did. But the law required someone to fill the post, and the city magistrates decided family ties were as good a qualification as any. By the time the French Revolution rolled around, his descendant, Charles-Henri Sanson, had become something of a legend, presiding over more than 3,000 executions, including that of Louis XVI himself. Imagine the irony. A man whose ancestors served the crown for generations, ending the life of the very king who employed him. But here's the thing. Despite their essential role, the Sansons lived under constant social exile. They had money but no respect. They lived in large houses but were treated as if they carried a contagious curse. Their children couldn't attend school with others. Their wives were avoided at church. Their families often had to import marriage partners from other executioner lineages, because literally no one else would marry into them. It got to the point where Europe developed an entire web of executioner dynasties, stretching across France, Germany, Austria, and Bohemia. The Schmidts, the Reindels, the Dieblers. Families who met, corresponded, and occasionally intermarried, creating what might be the least glamorous version of European nobility imaginable. Let's pause for a second and think about what that must have felt like growing up knowing your last name was synonymous with death. Other kids' fathers were blacksmiths or bakers. Yours was the guy who hanged the neighbor's uncle last week. You probably didn't get invited to many sleepovers. These families often lived on the edge of town, in houses provided by the city, sometimes near the gallows themselves. Their homes were both workplace and residence, filled with the tools of their trade: axes, ropes, branding irons, saws, and chains. Children grew up watching their fathers at work. Some even helped maintain the equipment or assisted in minor punishments once they were old enough. Not exactly a heartwarming family business, and yet, in their own quiet way, many executioners took pride in what they did. They saw themselves as instruments of justice. Not killers, but servants of law. Franz Schmidt, the Nuremberg executioner we met earlier, was particularly insistent on this point. His diary isn't bloodthirsty, it's dutiful. He often wrote about wanting to perform each execution cleanly and mercifully, with minimal suffering. It's strange to think of mercy in that context, but in a time when botched beheadings could stretch on for minutes, a single precise blow was considered a kind of grace. Now let's talk about love. Because even executioners fell in love, though as you can imagine it wasn't easy, since they were shunned by society. They usually married within their own circle. Other executioner families, knackers, gravediggers, or sometimes criminals who had received pardons through their service. Yes, in some places, a condemned man could have his death sentence commuted if he agreed to take up the axe himself. That's how a few executioner families began, as lineages of former convicts. Imagine your great-great-grandfather started the family business because he stole a chicken, got caught, and decided, "Sure, I'll become the town hangman instead." History really is full of career pivots. Some families grew surprisingly wealthy. The Sansons of France owned land, horses, even fine clothes. But no matter how rich they became, they couldn't buy respectability. In one case, an executioner's daughter was nearly married to a minor nobleman, until his relatives found out who her father was. The engagement was cancelled, the family scandalized, and the poor girl was reportedly sent to a convent. So much for upward mobility. By the 18th century, executioner families began to form their own subculture, what historians sometimes call a professional caste. They had their own codes, traditions, and even their own reputations for skill. One city might boast of its clean and quick executioner, while another had one known for theatrics, a showman who liked to talk to the condemned before the axe fell. It was macabre, but oddly competitive, and when there were no executions, they visited each other. Yes, executioner social calls. Imagine a dinner party where everyone at the table has their own favorite method of decapitation. Probably not the most cheerful conversation, but hey, you work with what you've got. Over time, these families began to collect knowledge, not just about death, but about life. Anatomy, wound care, even herbal medicine. Because remember, executioners often doubled as healers. They stitched wounds, set bones, and treated infections. Some even kept meticulous medical notes. Franz Schmidt, again, was recorded as having treated over 1,500 patients during his lifetime, far more than he executed. So while society saw him as a killer, in practice, he saved more lives than he took. That's the quiet contradiction at the heart of their story. Let's float now to the 18th century, when the profession was slowly losing its stigma. Just a little. As Enlightenment ideas spread across Europe, public executions became less theatrical and more bureaucratic, less crowd spectacle, more official procedure. Executioners started wearing uniforms instead of ragged clothes. They received regular salaries, pensions, and, in some cases, the right to live among ordinary citizens again. For the first time, some began to see themselves not as pariahs, but as officers of justice. Still, old habits die hard. People continued crossing the street to avoid them. Kids still whispered about the hangman's house, and the profession still passed quietly from father to son, like a secret no one wanted to admit existed. One curious detail: executioners were sometimes expected to perform entirely unrelated civic duties. In some towns, they served as animal control, chasing stray dogs, catching rats, and disposing of carcasses. In others, they worked as minor law enforcement officers, policing taverns, breaking up brawls, or dragging drunkards to jail. Basically, if a task was unpleasant, filthy, or socially awkward, the executioner probably did it. Because why stop at killing people when you can also clean their gutters? There's a strange kind of respect buried in that, though. Even as they were shunned, executioners kept communities functioning. They handled what no one else wanted to touch, literally and metaphorically. They were the dark mirror of civilization. Proof that for every king, There had to be someone in the shadows making justice look neat and tidy. When we come back next time, we'll drift into part 3. Between the axe and the altar, executioners as healers and superstitious figures. We'll look at why people lined up to buy charms made from hangman's ropes, how executioners were secretly seen as lucky, and how some of them became folk heroes in their own twisted way, because nothing says contradiction quite like a man who's both the hand of death and the town's best doctor. Hey there again. If you're still with me, that probably means you've either fallen asleep or you're the kind of person who finds 16th century sanitation practices oddly comforting. Either way, welcome back. Tonight, we're wandering into one of the strangest paradoxes in all of European history. The moment when the people best known for taking lives somehow became known for saving them. Executioners, as healers. Because of course they were. Let's start with the obvious. Executioners knew the human body better than almost anyone else. Not by choice, of course. When your day job involves decapitation, dismemberment, or breaking bones on a wheel, you develop what one might call an intimate familiarity with anatomy. They knew where joints connected. They knew how muscles tore, how veins bled, how quickly someone could lose consciousness. And in a time before formal medical schools were common, that kind of knowledge made them weirdly valuable. So while everyone avoided them in church, they were also the first people called when a farmer broke his leg or a child fell into the mill. In Nuremberg, our old friend Franz Schmidt kept detailed notes about his medical work. Between 1593 and 1617, he treated more than 15,000 patients. He set bones, drained abscesses, and even performed minor surgeries, all while being legally forbidden to live inside the city walls. Imagine being the best doctor in town, but not allowed to sit in the same tavern as your patients. That's medieval irony in its purest form. Now, this connection between executioners and medicine wasn't accidental. In the 15th and 16th centuries, barbers and surgeons were often grouped together under the same professional guilds. And guess who sometimes got roped into those guilds too? Yep, the hangmen. They shared tools, razors, knives, saws, and sometimes shared training. If a barber surgeon learned how to amputate a leg, the executioner knew how to do it faster. Not delicately perhaps, but efficiently. But healing wasn't the only strange side hustle. Executioners also became deeply tangled in superstition, because despite being feared, they were also believed to carry a certain supernatural potency. You see, people in the Middle Ages were convinced that contact with death gave someone special powers. The executioner, being the most death-adjacent person around, was practically radioactive with magical energy. So people started buying charms and remedies connected to them. Little trinkets thought to bring health, luck, or fertility. One of the most popular? Pieces of the hangman's rope. If you could get a small length of rope that had been used to execute someone, especially a murderer, you supposedly had a charm against misfortune. Gamblers wore them to dice games. Soldiers carried them into battle. And women sometimes tied them around their waists during childbirth for easy labor, because nothing says soothing birthing energy like a souvenir from a public strangling. Then there was the executioner's blood remedy. Yes, it's exactly what it sounds like. People believed that the blood of an executed man had healing properties. Epilepsy, gout, and even mental illness were said to vanish if you drank it fresh. At some executions, crowds would actually rush forward with cups and cloths to collect the dripping blood. The executioner, always the opportunist, sometimes helped, selling vials of it for a few coins. One 17th century report from Germany describes an executioner who mixed the blood with wine and sold it as saintly tonic. He made a fortune and was later fined, not for fraud, but for conducting business without a market license. Priorities. Executioners also sold the fat of executed criminals as a balm for wounds and arthritis. It was known as hangman's grease. And because medieval Europe had the attention span of a magpie in a candle shop, this gruesome product became a wildly popular household medicine. By the late 1500s, entire apothecaries stocked it. Some even faked it, rendering ordinary animal fat and labeling it authentic executioner's lard. So yes, fake. Executioner fat was Europe's first counterfeit wellness product. If you're wondering whether all of this creeped out the executioners themselves, the answer is complicated. Some leaned into it. After all, if you're already cursed, you might as well make it profitable. Others were deeply uncomfortable, but too poor to refuse. In small towns, where they had almost no other income, these charms and remedies were the difference between survival and starvation. And if the townspeople were going to hate them anyway, what harm could a little mystical side business do? Let's drift now to 18th century France, where the profession was starting to shift from superstition to something resembling modern medicine. The Sanson family. Yes, still them, had begun studying anatomy in earnest. Charles-Henri Sanson, the same man who executed Louis XVI, also performed medical dissections for Parisian physicians. It's an odd image. The royal executioner collaborating with Enlightenment scientists, slicing open corpses for the advancement of human knowledge. He once wrote that, "The guillotine, in its precision, is not only merciful, it is scientific." Which is exactly the kind of sentence that makes you both impressed and slightly uncomfortable. Let's pause a moment on the guillotine. Actually, when it was introduced in 1792, it was meant to make executions more humane, quick, clean, equal. Because, of course, the French Revolution wanted equality in death too. For executioners, it also meant a strange new chapter. Their work became more mechanical, less performative. Instead of swinging an axe or tying ropes, they operated a device. The ritual, the spectacle, faded, and with it, much of their old mystique. The hangman's rope lost its power, the crowd's fascination dimmed. Executioners became bureaucrats, less feared, less revered, and frankly, a little bored. Still, the old superstitions lingered. In rural Europe, people continued visiting executioners for charms well into the 19th century. In some parts of Germany, newlyweds touched the executioner's hand for good luck. In others, he was asked to bless infants, a bizarre custom, but one rooted in the idea that someone who dealt with death could somehow ward it off. Life, death, and luck all tangled together as always. Now, imagine being that man, standing in a square full of people who whispered your name like a curse, yet lined up after the execution to buy your charms. It must have been a lonely, confusing existence, half healer, half omen, half doctor, half demon. He might mend a child's leg in the morning and take someone's life in the afternoon, and both acts would be greeted with the same mixture of fear and gratitude. By the 1800s, as public executions began to disappear, many of these figures quietly faded into the background. Some retired to farms, some became minor police officials. But even then, the legends stuck. In folklore, the executioner remained a strange, ghostly archetype, the man who stood between worlds, carrying death in one hand and life in the other. He was the town's necessary evil, and, in a way, its accidental saint. Hey again, if you've somehow made it this far, either you're dedicated or you've fallen asleep with your headphones still in. Either way, welcome back to the world's slowest descent into the bureaucratic afterlife of executioners. Tonight, we're watching their twilight years. That strange period between the late 18th and early 20th centuries, when the professional hangman became something between a relic, a curiosity, and, briefly, a celebrity no one wanted to meet. Let's begin where we left off, France. Because, of course, France has the most detailed record of how to make even death administrative. By the early 1800s, the Sanson family, who'd been running France's executions like a grim family business for over a century, were starting to fade from glory. After Charles-Henri Sanson's death in 1806, his sons carried on the work, but the world around them was changing fast. The guillotine had made executions quick, efficient, and mostly impersonal. Crowds still gathered, yes, but the fascination had dulled. The old days of theatrical hangings, public speeches, and nervous drum rolls were gone. The executioner no longer stood center stage. He was now just a man in a coat, performing a job. While the crowd yawned behind their newspapers, modernity had arrived, and with it came paperwork. By the mid-19th century, France had turned its executioners into fully salaried state employees. They were given official residences, uniforms, and travel allowances. Their work had to be recorded in detail. Each execution logged with the time, the method, and the name of the condemned. If there's a more depressing version of clerical efficiency, I haven't found it. Imagine being one of the Sanson heirs, sitting at your desk, filling out execution reports like a tax accountant. There's something almost tragic about it. The loss of mystery, replaced with bureaucracy, but maybe, for the executioners themselves, it was a relief. No more jeering crowds, no more superstitious customers asking for hangman's grease. Just a quiet, state-sanctioned job, with predictable hours and a government pension, assuming you didn't get decapitated by your own machine first. Let's float north to England, where the tone was a little different. England clung to public executions much longer, because nothing says moral instruction like hanging someone in front of 1,000 drunk, Spectators on a Monday morning. The last public hanging in Britain took place in 1868, and the man in charge? A certain William Calcraft, perhaps the most infamous English hangman of the 19th century. Calcraft started as a cobbler, then somehow landed a job feeding cats to the lions at the Tower of London. Yes, really. Apparently, that counted as relevant experience for public execution work. He went on to hang over 400 people during his career. Though hang might be too generous a term, Calcraft was notoriously sloppy. He preferred short drop hangings, which meant most of his victims didn't die instantly, but strangled slowly as the crowd jeered and occasionally threw food. It was grim, chaotic, and morbidly popular, and Calcraft, despite his botched record, became a reluctant celebrity. By the 1870s, the world had changed again. Newspapers were everywhere, and even executioners had PR problems. Public executions were being abolished, replaced with private ones behind prison walls. But journalists still loved a good story, and the hangman's name always sold papers. Men like William Marwood, who succeeded Calcraft, were treated almost like minor celebrities. Marwood invented the long drop technique, a more precise and instant method that broke the neck cleanly. He called it the scientific hanging. It's oddly poetic. Even the hangman wanted progress. Marwood gave interviews, posed for sketches, and claimed he performed his work humanely, as the Almighty intended. Which is the kind of thing you only say when you've been explaining your job to horrified strangers for 20 years. Across Europe, similar transformations were unfolding. In Germany, the hereditary executioner families had mostly dissolved by the late 1800s. The old dynasties, the Schmidts, the Reindls, faded into middle-class anonymity. Some changed their surnames entirely to escape the stigma. Imagine introducing yourself as Franz Schmidt in polite company and watching everyone mentally count how many heads you've taken. In Austria and Prussia, executioners became state officers, trained by the Justice Ministry and kept anonymous. Their names were often classified, their faces unseen by the public. It was as if society wanted the death penalty to exist, but not to think about it. The hangman had gone from feared to forgotten, a necessary ghost haunting the margins of modern law. Then came the 20th century. By now, executioners had become rare specialists, no longer hereditary, but still professional. In France, the office of Monsieur de Paris, the official state executioner, continued well into the 1930s. One of the last men to hold the title was Anatole Diebler, the great-grandson of a long line of executioners stretching back to the 18th century. He was neat, polite, punctual, the ideal civil servant. He even carried his guillotine apparatus in a black van, which he called his voiture de justice, his car of justice. He executed over 400 people, traveling across France with calm precision, usually arriving at dawn. Newspapers followed his movements obsessively. Diebler spotted at the Gare du Nord, one headline read, as if he were a celebrity chef or a traveling illusionist. People whispered his name in cafes. Some treated him like a grim national curiosity. Others pretended he didn't exist. It was the same contradiction that haunted every executioner before him. The man who held both authority and disgust, fascination and silence. When Anatole Diebler died suddenly in 1939, collapsing at a Paris metro station on his way to an execution, the crowd that gathered around him reportedly didn't recognize him at first. Only when someone found his identity papers did they realize they were standing over the dead body of the nation's hangman, and then the applause started. Not out of cruelty, but sheer awkward disbelief. The man who had ended so many lives had finally met the one ending he couldn't control. And in that moment, France's long line of executioners truly ended too. Elsewhere, the profession lingered like a shadow. Britain's last official hangman, Albert Pierrepoint, worked into the 1950s. He executed over 400 people, including war criminals from World War II. Men he'd later describe in his memoir as ordinary, frightened human beings. Pierrepoint was a meticulous, tidy man. He treated his work like a moral burden rather than a duty. And when he retired, he opened a pub. He called it Help the Poor Struggler, which, considering the clientele probably didn't know his full resume, feels like either the best or worst marketing decision ever made. He never talked much about his work behind the bar. But when he did, he said something that sums up the entire history of the executioner's profession. When the rope tightens, it's not retribution that drops. It's just another man. By the time the 20th century ended, so did most of Europe's execution traditions. France abolished the death penalty in 1981. Britain followed. Germany, even earlier. The executioner, once the symbol of state power, quietly vanished. No farewell, no ceremony. Just a line drawn in the law, and then silence. It's a strange sort of ending. After centuries of fear, hatred, and fascination, the profession that no one wanted to acknowledge finally ceased to exist, and no one missed it, still. Their legacy lingers. In old records, medical treatises, folklore, and ghost stories, the executioner has become a symbol, not a man. Justice without empathy, duty without comfort, and the uneasy truth that civilization always hides someone in the shadows to do its dirtiest work. They were never heroes, never villains, just people. Tired men with calloused hands, doing the one job everyone needed done, but no one wanted to look at. And when there were no executions, they waited, sharpened their blades, treated a wound, fed their families, and wondered perhaps how it felt to live without the shadow of death always standing behind them. You can't really erase a profession like that. You can outlaw it, bury the tools, melt down the blades, but something always lingers. A whisper, a chill, a strange weight in the ground where the scaffold once stood. Every city that ever practiced execution has its ghosts. They don't appear in tourist brochures, but they're there. Quiet, unmarked corners that once drew thousands. Take London, for example. Walk through Tyburn, near Marble Arch. Today, it's all cars, lights, and the rhythm of modern life. But for nearly 600 years, this was one of the most infamous killing grounds in the world. From 1196 to 1783, over 50,000 people were executed here. Thieves, rebels, heretics, the poor, the unlucky, all met their end at the Tyburn tree, a triple gallows that could hang 24 people at once. Today, a small plaque marks the spot. You'd walk right past it if you didn't know. No tourists gather, no guide explains. But beneath the pavement, there are bones. A layer of silent witnesses, pressed into the soil of the city, and if you stand there at dawn before the traffic rises, you can almost feel the crowd, a sea of faces, long gone, still watching an empty space that once decided the boundary between life and law. In Paris, there's another ghost. At Place de la Concorde, tourists take selfies beside fountains and statues. But during the Revolution, this was the stage for the guillotine, a machine that turned justice into spectacle and death into routine. For years, the executioners of Paris, the Sansons, then the Dieblers, worked here beneath the same sky that now hosts designer boutiques. When the last guillotine fell, the city sighed with relief, but kept the memory hidden under the cobblestones. The wood was burned, the ropes replaced, the stains washed away. But you can't wash away the fact that thousands of heads once rolled where lovers now take evening walks. It's not morbid, exactly. It's history, quietly refusing to vanish. Even in places that never built grand gallows, the shadow remains. In small European towns, you'll still find hangman's trees, old oaks with twisted branches, kept alive because no one dared to cut them down. Locals whisper that their wood brings bad luck, that birds refuse to nest there, that on some nights, you can hear the creak of a rope in the wind. It's superstition, of course, but every superstition hides a truth, that people never really stopped thinking about what happened there. And then there are the tools, scattered across museums, displayed behind glass with polite captions. Executioner's sword, Nuremberg, 16th century. Original guillotine blade, Paris, 1793. Objects once held by living hands, now stripped of their purpose, sanitized into history. But look closely. You can still see the craftsmanship, the way the steel was balanced for precision, the careful engravings, the initials of the maker. They weren't just weapons, they were instruments of authority, symbols of the idea that law could be made visible. And maybe that's what unsettles us most. Because when you stand in front of one, you realize it's not a relic of barbarism. It's a reflection of ourselves, our need for order, our fear of chaos, our willingness to make someone else carry the burden of consequence. In some archives, you can still find the names. The ledgers of executioners read like a second history of Europe, written not by kings or scholars, but by the men who ended what others began. Franz Schmidt of Nuremberg kept a meticulous diary. Between 1573 and 1617, he executed 394 people, and wrote down everyone, along with their crimes, their ages, and how they met their end. He wasn't cruel. He was orderly. Today I executed a thief who stole bread from the market. He confessed with tears. God forgive him. It's jarring. the calm tone, the humanity tucked inside the bureaucracy. By the end of his life, Schmidt retired with honor, granted citizenship by the city that once shunned him. He became a healer, literally a physician. The man who once killed for the law now saved lives. Maybe that's redemption, or maybe it's proof that the line between justice and mercy was always thinner than we thought. And yet, the executioner still appears, in movies, in novels, in nightmares. He wears the black hood, though no real hangman ever did. He's faceless, voiceless, a symbol of consequence itself. Because the truth is, every civilization creates an executioner. Maybe not a man with a blade anymore, but a system, a mechanism, a faceless process that decides who deserves to be punished, and who simply disappears. We've made it cleaner now, more clinical, less bloody. But the ghost remains. Every courtroom, every prison, every law that weighs life and death still carries a faint echo of that old, cold silence that followed the fall of a blade. So what remains of them? Not much. A few names, a few stories, and the uneasy knowledge that civilization has always needed someone willing to do what others couldn't. They were hated. They were feared. They were necessary, and then, when we no longer needed them, we erased them. But history doesn't forget. It just buries things deeper, and maybe that's why, when you stand in an old square at night, and the wind moves just right, you get that strange feeling, as if someone's still there, watching from the edge of the crowd, waiting for the moment when duty calls again. The ghost of the gallows never really leaves. It just changes shape, and maybe in some quiet way it's still whispering to us, reminding us that justice, in all its forms, always comes at a price.